Arizona territory. May of '89 was the kind of hot that pressed a body down from the inside out. By late morning, the light lay over the little rail stop like a sheet of white iron, and the ties on the track had gone silver with heat. Florence Abner stood there anyway. Her boots were streaked with dust. Hem of her wedding dress gone the color of old bone. 3 days she'd been waiting beside those rails. 3 days of watching the line of steel vanish into the wavering horizon and listening for a whistle that never came. The first day, she'd stood straight and proud, telegram folded neat in her gloved hand. The second, the words on that thin slip of paper had blurred in front of her, anger and shame washing over her in hard, choking waves. By the third, she'd stopped looking at the message at all. She just held her skirts close, eyes fixed on the empty distance as if she could pull a groom out of thin air by sheer will. Her canteen held only a mouthful of warm water. The last scrap of bread was gone before sunrise. Her lips had cracked and a dull beat had settled behind her eyes, but still she stayed where the platform boards met the sand. A woman who left Kansas for a promised life in Tucson did not want to be the one who turned back first. There was no depot agent to ask for help, just the old station house, shut tight, its windows filmed with years of grit. Freight trains didn't bother with Tucson anymore unless they had reason. Brides weren't reason enough. Florence let herself sink down onto the edge of the platform, fingers resting on the smooth wood worn by 1,000 boots before hers. Somewhere behind her, brush rattled in the thin wind. A grasshopper clicked and sprang away. The whole land seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do. She heard the sound before she saw him. It came thin at first, just a faint thudding through the air. Not thunder, not a train. Hooves beating a slow, steady rhythm against the baked ground. She pushed herself to her feet, one hand lifting to shield her eyes. Out along the shimmering rails, a rider took shape. First a blur, then a man on a dark horse, the animal's mane blowing like smoke behind it. He rode easy, like saddle and spine had long ago decided to be one thing. As he drew near, she saw that his shirt was streaked with trail dust, his hat brim pulled low. The sun picked out the hard set of his jaw and the lines at the corner of his mouth, the kind a man earned from squinting into weather he couldn't change. He reined in a few yards off, the horse snorting, hide damp with sweat. "You all right there, miss?" he asked. His voice came out low and careful, as if a loud word might cause something to break. Florence swallowed, throat dry as the tracks. "I was to be married 3 days past," she said. "He was meant to meet me here." The stranger's gaze flicked from her dress to the empty rails, then back. "You've stood out here since then?" She nodded once. He swung down from the saddle in a fluid motion, boots landing soft in the dust. "Name's Cade Valen," he said, giving the reins a loose wrap around a post. "I was bound for a mining camp near Tubac." His eyes lingered on her face. "Figure you're in a worse way than any man digging ore." Only now did she really look at him. A pale strip marked his cheek where a bandana had shielded skin from the sun. His eyes were storm gray, the kind that had seen hard country and learned not to flinch from it. "I'm Florence Abner," she managed, "from Kansas. I sold what I had for the fair. He said we'd marry in Tucson and start a ranch together." The words tasted foolish in her mouth. Cade removed his hat, turning it in rough hands. You got any food left, Miss Abner? She shook her head. He reached into a saddlebag and drew out a wrapped bundle. Biscuits and a strip of dried meat. Not fancy, but it'll sit in your stomach better than dust and disappointment. Florence took it with both hands, fingers shaking. The first bite nearly undid her. She hadn't realized hunger could hum that loud in a body. Cade sat beside her on the platform, but left a span of wood between them, eyes on the horizon while she ate. You waited 3 days, he said after a stretch of quiet. Takes a stout kind of courage to do that. I thought he loved me, she whispered. The letters sounded true. Some fellows can dress lies up real pretty when they know they won't ever have to stand in front of them, he answered, voice flat. He let the words hang there and didn't push them any further. A hawk swung lazy circles overhead. The heat shimmered off the rails. Cade drew a slow breath. I've got a place down by the river, he said. Few hours' ride from here. Small cabin, well out front, couple goats that think they own the yard. He paused. You stay out here. This sun'll do you in before regret does. You come with me. You'll have water and a roof while you decide your next step. Florence stiffened. Men don't help for nothing, she said, not looking at him. I'm no saint, he replied steady. But I'm not trading favors with a woman left on a platform. My sister got stranded like that once. I weren't there for her. His jaw tightened. I'm here now, and if I ride with you, she whispered, then I'll see you safe to my cabin, he said. You'll get a clean bed and time to breathe. Nothing else, unless you say otherwise. There was no pleading in it, no push, just an offer laid plain. Her fingers drifted to the narrow band tied to a ribbon at her wrist, the ring meant to seal that promised marriage. For a long moment she stared at it, metal winking dull in the dust-thick light. Then she tugged the ribbon loose. The ring lay in her palm, cool against burned skin. She thought of the train that never came, her father's grave back in Kansas, her sister's crowded house in Missouri, the way everyone had spoken as if her life would begin only when some man chose to claim it. Quietly, Florence let the ring slip from her hand. It hit the dirt with the softest sound and disappeared among the pebbles at the platform's edge. She stood. All right, Mr. Vallon, she said, voice thin but steady. Take me away from here. Cade rose with her and offered his hand to help her mount. His touch was firm, not possessive. She settled in the saddle ahead of him, fingers gripping the horn. When he swung up behind, he kept just enough space between them to guide the horse without crowding her. They turned away from the silent tracks. As the station fell behind them, Florence didn't look back. The only trace of her old life lay buried in that dust. The sun slid westward, throwing long shadows over the desert as they rode toward a life she hadn't planned, alongside a man whose story she did not yet know. And the land, wide and watchful all around them, seemed to lean in to hear what would come next. They rode for a long time without talk, hooves thudding a patient beat over packed earth and scattered stone. The heat softened as the afternoon wore on, the sky turning from white to a gentler gold. Here and there, low scrub broke the distance, gray-green against the sand. A jackrabbit tore off through the sage, all legs and fear. You from Arizona, Mr. Vallon? Florence asked at last, needing to hear something besides the wind. Just Cade, he said. No, ma'am, Colorado. Back when it was still mostly talk and survey lines. Came south after the war. His voice thinned a little at that word. You fought. I carried a rifle because someone put it in my hands. A pause. Found out a boy can see a lot of dying before he's old enough to shave proper. She let that be. War stories lived best where they were laid. The day widened and then began to narrow toward evening. At last, a dark smudge appeared ahead. Trees gathered around a dip in the land. As they drew closer, she saw a small cabin shouldered up against a rocky rise. Its logs weathered a soft gray. A lean-to hugged one side, and beyond it, a fenced patch of ground waited for seed. He pulled the horse up near the well, where the air felt almost cool. "Home," he said simply. Florence slid down, legs unsteady from hours in the saddle. Cade's hand hovered near her elbow, steadying without gripping. She crossed to the well, and he hauled up a bucket, rope creaking. The first swallow of water shocked her system, clear and cold. She drank again, slower this time, then splashed her face and the back of her neck. The cabin door complained on its hinges when he pushed it open. "Ain't much to look at," he warned, "but it stands up in a storm." Inside the single room was small but ordered. A narrow cot pressed against one wall, blankets folded neat, a table with 2 chairs sat near the window, and a shelf of tin dishes and a few books lined the far corner. The place smelled of cedar, smoke, and something unmistakably his. Sweat, leather, a faint edge of tobacco. "I'll bring your things in," he said. "I left most of them behind," she replied. "Didn't see the point of carrying what wouldn't fit on a new life." He nodded, as if that made sense to him. "There's a basin there," he added. "Clean water in the jug. You can wash up while I see to the horse." When he'd gone outside, Florence stood alone in the small room. The quiet pressed around her, not like the raw emptiness of the station, but more like a held breath. She touched the cot, the smooth, worn surface of the table, the little window looking out toward the river. None of this was hers, yet the thought of going back to that platform made something deep in her fold in on itself. She washed the dust from her face and arms, feeling almost lightheaded as the grime lifted away. Her reflection in the bit of wavy glass above the basin startled her. Eyes ringed and red, skin burnt, hair escaping every pin. She hardly recognized the woman staring back. By the time Cade came in, the light outside had gone soft. He carried in his saddlebags and a small sack of meal, setting them by the table. "I'll throw together something warm," he said. "You sit. You look like you could fall over with a strong wind." She almost protested, then realized he was right. Her knees trembled when she lowered herself into the chair. He moved around the little stove with quiet efficiency, striking a match, setting a kettle, cutting fat back into a pan. The simple clatter of tin and iron filled the room. It was a homely sound, and for the first time since she stepped off the train days ago, Florence's shoulders loosened a little. They ate stew, thick with beans and whatever dried meat he had left, each with a tin bowl in hand. He didn't press conversation. When she spoke, he listened, and when she fell silent, he let the quiet be. I left my father's house in April," she said slowly. "He passed last year. My sister wrote from Missouri, said I could come help with the children. But all anyone talked about was getting me married before I dried up like last year's corn." She tried to laugh, but couldn't quite find the sound. Then this man from Arizona started writing. Said he had land. Said he needed a wife. "You believed him," Kate said, not unkind. "I believed in the chance," she answered, "in some place where I could be more than an extra mouth at someone else's table." He studied her for a moment. You were promised better than a sunburn and an empty platform. She set her bowl down. What do you expect of me, bringing me here? The question had been sitting in her chest all day. Cade leaned back, forearms resting on his knees. I expect you to sleep under a roof tonight instead of under buzzards' shadows. He said, beyond that, Miss Abner, I expect nothing. His gaze didn't waver. You're not a stray calf I dragged home for Brandon. You're a person who needed a way off that platform. I could offer it. He hesitated, then added, my sister waited on a man once. Stood 3 hours outside a church back in Pueblo in a new dress she paid for herself. He never came. Folks talked about her for months. His jaw went tight. I was out with a freighting job, too far away to walk her home. I always figured if I had been there, she wouldn't have had to face those stairs alone. What became of her? Florence asked softly. She married later. Not to that man. A shadow crossed his face. Still carries the look of that day in her eyes, though. Makes a brother think. The last of the stew cooled between them. Outside, a coyote yipped somewhere up on the ridge, the sound thin and lonely. Cade rose and set the bowls aside. You take the cot, he said. I'll bed down by the hearth. You don't have to give it up, she protested. He shook his head. I've slept on worse than a hard floor. You need a good night more than I do. She looked at the narrow bed, then at the single rough blanket laid out near the fireplace. I've had enough of being handled like I might break, she murmured. Then, surprising herself, she added, but I could use someone close that isn't asking questions. He studied her face, the strain around her mouth. All right, he said at last. I'll sit a while, if that's what you mean. He took a place beside her on the edge of the cot, careful to leave space between them. The two of them stared into the small fire as it settled into coals. Florence didn't cry. Cade didn't pry. Their shoulders touched, solid and warm. Outside, the desert night gathered itself around the little cabin, and for the first time in days, she felt the weight of aloneness ease, just a fraction, what she hadn't yet decided. And what the dark seemed to hold its own breath over was whether this cabin was a stop along a broken trail or the first step towards something like home. Cade was up before the sun, as men who work stock tend to be. The faint gray of approaching dawn slipped through the cracks in the shutters, while the coals still glowed under a skin of ash. He rose quietly so as not to disturb Florence, who slept curled on the cot, face slack with exhaustion. Outside, a cool breath came off the river and slid through the gaps in the log walls. He coaxed the fire back to life, added juniper kindling, and set a pot to boil. Goat bells jingled faint in the lean-to. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster that wasn't his announced the new day to anyone who cared to listen. By the time Florence stirred, stretching like someone who hadn't trusted sleep in a long while, the kettle was steaming. She sat up slowly, brushing hair out of her face with both hands. Do you always rise this early, Frio? She asked, voice rough with sleep. Old habits, he said, handing her a tin cup with hot water and a scrap of leaf steeping at the bottom. Work comes with the light, whether a man's ready or not. She stepped outside, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and stood beside him while the sky pinked over the ridge. The rocks caught the light first, glowing like iron in a forge before cooling to rose. You keep animals? She asked. 2 goats, most days. he answered, casting a look toward the lean-to. They've got a talent for undoing latches. They got no business touching. But they come running when they're hungry, same as any creature. I can help, she said quickly. I know washing and mending and how to mind a garden. I can pull my share. I never doubted it, he replied. By mid-morning, she had rolled up her sleeves and set to the wash, kneeling at a tub near the well, arms deep in soapy water. Cade worked a few yards away, mending a sagging gate, the ring of his hammer against wire marking time. The quiet between them felt different than it had on the platform, less like loneliness, more like a space where two people's thoughts could move without bumping. At noon they ate beans and leftover biscuits on the porch, plates balanced on their knees. The shade of the small overhang was a blessing, and a thin breeze drifted off the water. You aiming to go back east? Kate asked after a while, eyes on the yard instead of her face. Florence chewed slowly, considering. I don't know where I'd go, she admitted. My father's buried on the farm. My sister's house already spills over with children. There's no money for me to simply wander. He nodded once, absorbing that. You could stay on here a while, he said. Long as you need. The land doesn't mind company. I didn't ride west looking for shelter, she said quietly. I was hunting a place that might feel like mine. I thought marriage would bring that with it. I thought he would. A humorless smile touched her mouth. Folks talk like a husband is a key to a locked door, Kate said. But I've seen women build homes out of nothing but their own backbone and a patch of ground. He turned to her then, gaze steady. You don't need a man to belong in this valley. You got hands that know work and a will that kept you standing on that platform when most would have folded. This place will answer to you same as it does to me. She studied him, weighing the sincerity in his voice. And if I decided I did want a man, she asked, the words barely more than breath, that'd be your choosing, he replied. Not a price you pay for a roof. The wind curled around them, lifting a strand of her hair across her cheek. Something knotted in her chest began to loosen. Toward evening, when the heat had bled out of the day, she wandered down to the riverbank. The water there ran low but steady, sliding over stones that had been in place longer than any man alive could remember. She stepped out of her boots, letting her bare feet sink into the cool mud at the edge. The land's harder than I thought it'd be, she said, when Kay joined her, boots crunching on gravel. But it's quieter. It doesn't make promises it can't keep. It'll take everything you give it, he answered, looking out over the slow water. But if you treat it fair, it has a way of giving something back. Maybe not what you expected. Maybe better. She bent to pick up a flat stone, turning it over in her fingers. I think I could learn these hills, she murmured. I can show you what I know, he said. Won't take long before you know as much as I do, maybe more. For the first time since his horse crested that horizon line near Tucson, she smiled without effort. It softened her face in a way he hadn't seen yet, stripping years of worry away. You ever lonely out here, Cade? She asked. He took his time answering. I was, he said, for a good long while. His hand swung at his side, fingers brushing hers. Not so much lately. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her fingers twine with his, palm to calloused palm. They walked back toward the cabin like that, no announcement made, no vow spoken, just two people choosing not to walk alone. That night, they sat under the cottonwood near the well, darkness rising around them as stars pricked through the sky. The trees' leaves whispered above, and the cabin window shone a small, steady light behind them. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence between them no longer felt like an empty room. It felt like a house slowly being furnished. Neither of them said it aloud, but both understood. Something had shifted on that river bank, and the path ahead would not be the same as the one that brought them here. The days slid into one another, each marked by chores and small changes that only people paying close attention would notice. That was the way of ranch life. Nothing grand, just one chore laid atop another until years had quietly stacked themselves. One bright morning, Florence stood halfway up a rough ladder, skirts tied back, hands smeared with tar. Cade held the bottom steady, boots braced apart as she pressed burlap into a cracked seam along the roof. "You ever fix a roof before, Epbo?" he called up. "Not above a chicken coop," she answered. No, and that one leaked if the rain came sideways." "You're already doing better than my first attempt," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I don't mind the height," she added. "It's this ladder I don't trust. It's honest, just ugly," he replied. She squinted down at him. "It sounds like someone I know." He didn't comment, but she caught the faint hook of a smile before turning back to her work. By the time they'd finished, her arms burned and her palms were full of splinters. When she climbed down, he handed her a damp cloth and a small knife for teasing the wood from her skin. They took their rest beneath the cottonwood, backs against the rough trunk, sun sifting through the leaves. The air smelled of pitch and warm earth. "I had a book once," she said, eyes half closed. "Story about a woman who crossed the country alone, lost everything along the way, but ended up with an orchard full of peaches." She laughed softly. "I don't even know if peaches will grow in land like this. I've seen them near the San Pedro," Cade said. "Takes patience and more water than we've got running through this wash, but it can be done." She looked at him sidelong. "You read many books, Cade Vallon?" "Enough to know I don't understand most of 'em," he said. "But I listen when folks who've seen more of the world talk." He plucked a blade of grass, twisting it between his fingers. "You thinking about writing your own story down?" She let the idea sit between them. "I used to think by now I'd be somewhere with curtains in the windows and 2 children underfoot," she admitted. "Thought my husband would say my name like it mattered." "You've still got time for all that," he said quietly. "Do you truly believe a person can start fresh?" she asked, "after they've been made sport of the way I have." Cade dug his heel into the dirt, eyes on some point far off. "I don't know about wiping a slate clean," he replied, "but I've seen folks keep stepping forward when they had every reason to lay down. Somehow, piece by piece, they ended up living a life that didn't look much like the one that hurt them." The wind moved through the branches above, sending shifting patterns of shadow across his face. "Did you ever love someone?" she asked before she could talk herself out of it. He looked away for a moment, jaw working. "There was a girl once," he said slowly, "near Durango after the war. Name of Marjorie, played the fiddle like it was the only language she trusted." A ghost of a smile tugged at his mouth. "Her father took one look at me, dust all over my boots, no land to my name, and decided I wasn't fit to haul their trash, much less court his daughter." "What did you do?" Florence asked. "Told her I'd come back inside a year with better prospects," he said. Signed on hauling freight, breaking colts, anything that put coin in my pocket. His fingers tightened around the grass. By the time I rode back, she'd married a man with more acres than sense. She wouldn't quite meet my eye when she told me. He didn't say more. The silence that followed carried the rest. Florence reached across the space between them and laid her hand lightly on his forearm. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was acknowledgement. 2 wounds touching. That evening, she sat on the small porch with her bare feet tucked up under her and a needle in hand. One of his shirts lay across her lap, seams frayed from years of work. She set about mending them, thread slipping in and out of fabric in neat, tidy rows. The light slanted warm through the doorway. Inside, Cade sorted through a jumble of tools at the table, wiping old oil and rust from metal, deciding which pieces might be coaxed back into service. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a man used to making do. When she finished, she carried the shirt in and laid it beside him. "Figured it'd give up on you if someone didn't take pity," she said. "You didn't have to," he answered. "I know." He looked up and held her gaze. "Florence," he began, then paused as if tasting the shape of what he meant to say. "I've got ground out back I never put to proper use. Seed I've held on to more out of habit than hope." She folded her arms loosely. "You offering me a job?" she teased. "I'm offering you a place," he replied. "We could set a field in the fall if you decide to stay. You keep your own name, or take mine if you want it, when a preacher comes through. We'd build what we can, slow and honest." She searched his face, looking for any sign of pity or possession. What she saw instead was a kind of steady quiet, like deep water. "You'd marry me just like that?" she asked. "I'd want to know you better yet," he said. "But I don't make light with vows. If I spoke them, I'd mean every word." Her breath hitched, not with girlish shock, but with the deep, unsettling awareness that this might be the very thing she wanted without knowing how to ask. "I'm not so concerned with what name I'd sign," she murmured. "I care more about the man standing beside it." He rose slowly, the old pine chair scraping against the floor. This time, when he took her hands in his, he didn't let go. The lamp on the table threw their shadows long across the wall. Outside, the night wind shifted, bringing with it the sharp scent of dry sage. Cade stepped closer until there was no polite space between them, only shared warmth and the quiet, mutual understanding that something had been spoken which could not be taken back. And in that small cabin, with the desert pressing close on all sides, it felt less like 2 lonely lives brushing, and more like a door closing gently on the long cold behind them, leaving a soft light burning within. By late summer, Florence had taken to waking before the rooster on the neighboring place found his voice. The cabin was cool and dim in those hours, air scented faintly with damp earth and mesquite. She dressed by feel so as not to disturb Cade, who slept near the hearth now, their separate beds quietly forgotten as the space between them had narrowed. She pumped water at the basin, careful with the handle to keep it from squealing, then stepped out into the first pale light. A thin skin of silver lay on the river bend, the low water catching the sky. Behind her, the door rasped open. "You'll wear the morning out if you keep chasing it this early," Cade said, voice still rough from sleep. "I heard coyotes nosing around the goats in the night." She turned with a half smile. "Figured I'd remind them the place is spoken for. They've sense enough to stay high once the sun's up, he said, pulling on his boots. But I'm not set on donating livestock to their education either. You told me there's a path along the ridge that leads to a spring, she said. 3 miles west? He nodded. Little basin tucked into the rock. Flowers cling to it like they're afraid the world'll forget them if they let go. I'd like to see it, she said. I've done enough waiting in one spot to last me a lifetime. My feet are asking for ground that leads somewhere. I'll saddle the horses, he replied. Been meaning to cut some wild tobacco up that way anyhow. They rode out after breakfast, canteens sloshing against the saddles, the air bright and clean in that way it sometimes was after a dry spell. The trail wound through cuts of stone and scattered juniper, hooves ringing where the rock rose close to the surface. The world felt larger up there, as if the basin and cabin were just a small pocket in something vast. When they finally crested the rise, the spring lay below them like a secret. A shallow pool gathered where water slipped from the rock, ringed with green. Clumps of yellow primrose and pale violet blossoms crowded the edges, bold against the bare stone. It's like the earth remembered color all at once, Florence breathed as she dismounted. Things have to grow tough out here, Kate said, tying off the reins. Beauty doesn't mean soft, not in this country. She knelt near the water's edge, careful not to crush the blooms, and brushed a petal with her fingertips. Back home, it was weed and sky as far as you could turn, she said. Fields straight as a line on a map. This seems older, wilder. Cade moved a little distance off to gather tobacco leaves, fingers sure as he worked. She watched the set of his shoulders, the way he'd placed his boots like he trusted the ground. You ever think you'd wind up here? She asked at last. With you? He said, glancing over his shoulder. With any of this, she answered. He considered. I figured I'd keep drifting until the trail ran out, he said. Some men are made for settling. I never thought I was one of them. And yet you built walls, planted fence posts, sunk a well. She stood and came toward him, folding a stalk of dried bloom between her fingers. Seems to me that's what a man does when some part of him is hoping to stay. He straightened, dusting his hands. Maybe I was waiting on a reason, he admitted. Nowadays I catch myself thinking about which tree would throw shade over a porch instead of what town I might ride through next. Her breath caught low in her chest at the quiet surety in his tone. Tell me something you've never told anyone, she said, half teasing, half serious. He hesitated, then spoke. When I was 15, there was a rancher near where we lived who beat his horses bloody for being scared of thunder, he said. One night, I slipped into his corral and took the youngest colt out, rode it 2 counties north, and told the marshal it had wandered. Man never got that animal back. A small smile tugged at her mouth. Good, she said simply. His eyes searched hers. Your turn. She looked out over the pool, watching sunlight tremble on the surface. When I was 13, I wanted to be a naturalist, she said. Didn't have that word for it, but I liked learning the names of things. I pressed flowers between the pages of the church ledger when no one was looking. What happened? He asked. The pastor found them. She huffed a soft laugh, devoid of humor. Said my head was too full of foolishness. Told me to think about marriage instead of petals. And now, Kate asked, Now I find myself wanting paper stout enough to hold whatever grows here," she said, meeting his gaze. "Might be I start pressing again." They stood quiet for a long while, the wind combing through the brush, the horses cropping sparse grass. Kate stepped close, not touching yet, but near enough she could feel the heat of him through her dress. "Florence," he said, voice low, "I don't want you thinking you owe me anything for a roof and supper. When I rode up to that platform, I wasn't bargaining. I just couldn't ride past." "I know that," she answered. "You've shown me who you are. I want you to stay," he went on, "but not because you've got nowhere else to go. I want you to stay because this place feels as much yours as mine." She held his gaze, eyes steady. "Then ask me," she said. He did. He didn't drop to a knee or dress it up with fancy talk. He just said her name and laid his heart in the open, and Florence said yes, not in a rush or a flutter, but like a woman planting her feet in soil she'd decided to claim. They rode back slow, sun high and hot at their backs. When they reached the cabin, the goats were pacing at the fence, complaining in thin bleats about the delay. Florence laughed, a sound bright and unguarded that surprised even her. That night, as the last light burned along the ridge like a line of fire, she stood in the doorway, watching Cade rake coals into a steady glow for supper. The sight of him there, familiar, solid, the glow painting his face, stirred something deep. "I was thinking," she said. "Dangerous habit," he replied without looking up. "I want morning glories along this sill," she continued. "Something that climbs and holds on." He glanced over, eyes soft. "We'll fetch seed next time we ride into Tubac," he said. "And a ledger," she added. "Paper that won't crumble when I press a life into it." He smiled then, small but sure, and nodded. Outside, the first stars pricked through the dark, and the vast desert settled around their little cabin like an old blanket finally laid where it belonged. Weeks later, the first row of corn pushed shy green blades through the soil behind the house. Florence knelt each morning to thin the weak sprouts and whisper stubborn encouragement to the strong. Cade built a trellis along the southern wall, and she strung twine in neat lines, waiting for vines that hadn't yet appeared. One hot morning, a wagon rolled into view, dust rising behind it. Cade shaded his eyes. "I know that rig," he muttered, fetching his rifle more out of habit than fear. The driver was a wiry woman with a face tanned like leather and a gap between her teeth. A boy of 12 rode beside her, bare feet braced on the wagon rail. "Clara Hodge," Cade called as they drew near. "Didn't reckon you for calling on neighbors. Didn't reckon you for keeping company," she shot back, nodding toward Florence. "I'm selling thread and vinegar today. Got dried peaches if the lady of the place has a mind for 'em." Florence stepped forward. "What's your price?" she asked. "For you?" "Soap," Clara said. "Word in Tucson was you waited 3 days on a man who never showed. Anyone with that kind of spine deserves fruit that isn't half rotten." Florence blinked, surprised that her shame had traveled faster than she had, and more surprised at the respect tucked behind the trader's grin. "I've a bar with rosemary in it," she said, "made back in Kansas and never used." "That'll do," Clara answered, tossing a small cloth bundle into Florence's hands. They traded, and Clara squinted at her again. "You planting roots here, girls?" she asked. "I am," Florence said. "Good. This country could use more women who don't scare easy." With that, Clara clucked to the mules and rattled off, leaving dust and the faint smell of vinegar behind. That night, after they'd eaten peaches boiled soft over biscuits and licked the sweetness from their fingers, Florence sat with a blank sheet of paper in her lap. Cade was oiling the window hinges by lamplight. "I want to write my sister," Florence said quietly, "but I don't know how to tell her all this." "You don't have to explain it," he said. "Just tell her what's true." She watched him test the hinges. "I want to say I found someone who sees me clear," she murmured. "Not for what I might someday be, not for what I left behind. Just for who I am standing on this patch of ground." "Then say that way," he replied. "And if you're not going back, maybe don't write it like you're leaving. Write it like you've arrived." She dipped the pen into ink and under the lamplight began. A few days later, Cade hitched the wagon and rode into Tubac. He needed seed, nails, and a length of gingham Florence had circled twice with her finger in the catalog. She stayed behind to mind the goats and mend a chewed section of fence. Storm clouds stacked up along the horizon by mid-afternoon, dark and heavy. When he rolled back into the yard, shirt streaked with dust and sweat, he handed her the bolt of cloth before he even climbed down. Her fingers smoothed over it, already measuring sleeves and skirt in her mind. No words were needed just then. His effort was written plain in every line of his face. That evening, thunder muttered low over the hills, and the air smelled of rain waiting to fall. Cade took her hand as they sat on the porch steps watching the sky. "I traded something today," he said. She glanced at him, brow lifting. "Old saddle horn," he went on. "Been with me since I left Colorado. Figured it was time I swapped it for something that belongs to the life I'm living now." He reached into his pocket and drew out a narrow silver ring, etched with the shapes of vines, curling like those that grew along the river. "I know you said you weren't fixed on names," he said, voice quiet. "But I'd be honored if you took mine. Not because you need it to stand here, but because I want to give it." The ring lay in his palm like a sliver of starlight. Florence felt the world narrow to the space between his hand and hers, to the steady weight of his gaze. "Yes," she said, almost whispering, but her voice did not tremble. She took the ring and slid it onto her finger, where it settled as if it had been waiting for that place all along. 2 weeks later, they stood under the cottonwood tree by the well, its leaves whispering overhead as if the land itself were performing the ceremony. Clara Hodge acted as witness, hands on her hips and grin wide, while her boy scraped out a tune on a battered fiddle, earnest, if not exactly in tune. Florence wore the gingham dress she'd stitched by lamplight, seams straight and strong. Cade had shaved for the occasion, nicking his chin in more than one spot, his face suddenly younger and oddly shy. Their vows were simple. No poetic speeches, no crowd to impress, just two people speaking promises plain, eyes locked, fingers laced. When it was done, Clara let out a whoop that startled the goats, and even the land seemed to brighten in the late afternoon light. Afterward, the three of them walked out to the field where cornstalks reached their waists. The sun settled low behind them, painting the young plants and the cabin and the faces of the newly married pair in gold. "Still think you weren't built for settling, Cade Vallon?" Florence asked, resting her head briefly against his shoulder. He drew her closer with one arm. "I reckon I was just holding out for the right piece of earth," he said, "and the right person to share it with. Time passed the way it does when you're busy living and forget to count. They added a second room to the cabin, Cade's hands roughened by hammer and saw, Florence's by hauling boards and smoothing plaster. Beans climbed the poles behind the house, Squash sprawled under the corn, and morning glories finally caught hold of the trellis along the southern wall, opening pale trumpets to the rising sun. In the spring, a baby girl arrived with the dawn, small and fierce, lungs announcing herself to every living thing along the river. They named her Ruth, not after any particular relative, but because the name felt steady and rooted, the way they wanted her life to be. Ruth grew sturdy and curious, dark hair sticking out in every direction, eyes bright. Florence pressed wildflowers between the pages of the ledger she'd finally bought, scribbling their names along the margins in a neat hand. Cade carved her a bench from mesquite and set it under the window where the light fell best. Sometimes he'd glance up from mending tack to see Florence sitting there, Ruth asleep against her shoulder, and petals spread on the page like little pieces of captured sunlight. They didn't shout in that household. They'd both heard enough raised voices in other lives. When trouble came, as it will to any place on the map, they met it side by side, speaking low and sure. On warm evenings, after the chores were done and Ruth had worn herself out chasing chickens, Florence and Cade sat on the porch with their fingers laced, watching the stars gather in the huge sky. The corn rustled in the breeze. Coyotes yipped somewhere deep in the hills, distant and harmless. Sometimes Florence thought of the lonely stretch of track at Tucson, the heat shimmering above the rails, the ring vanishing into the dust. She remembered how small and foolish she'd felt, how certain that was the end of any good story meant for her. Now, with Cade's shoulder pressed against hers and their child breathing softly in the cradle just inside the door, that memory felt like the first hard mile of a trail that had led, step by stubborn step, to this porch. They hadn't planned this life. It hadn't arrived wrapped in promises or tied up neat. They'd chosen it piece by piece, through patched roofs, traded peaches, pressed flowers, and shared mornings, until it became something solid enough to lean on. Out here under the wide desert sky, their little home held fast, and in the soft murmur of the wind through the corn, if you listened close, you might hear an old truth. Sometimes the heart finds what it needs, not at the station where it was promised, but down a dusty side trail, at the door of a stranger's cabin where two weary souls decide to stop walking alone.